She was 12 years old, alone in a scrapyard at 5 in the morning, and the trunk of that rusted sedan was screaming. Not metaphorically, not quietly. Screaming, fists against metal, desperate and raw, like something dying inside a tin coffin. Harper Quinn stood in the frozen fog of a Seattle winter and made a choice that would unravel every truth she thought she knew about herself. The man she pulled from that trunk was bleeding, bound, and barely conscious. But when his eyes found hers through the darkness, when he saw the crescent scar near her temple, his face collapsed into something far more terrifying than pain. He looked at her like he'd seen a ghost, because maybe he had. If you've ever lost someone you loved and spent years wondering if they could still be out there, this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Stay with me all the way to the end. Hit that like button right now. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Let's go. The scrapyard smelled like rust and standing water and something underneath both of those things. Something older, like the cold itself had weight. Like the air between the towers of crushed cars carried the memory of every broken thing that had ever been left there to rot. Harper Quinn moved through it the way she moved through most things, fast, quiet, and without looking up. She had a system. She always had a system. Left side of the yard first because Delmar, the overnight watchman, started his rounds on the right at exactly 4:47 a.m., and she had roughly 11 minutes before he doubled back past the chain-link gap she used to enter. 11 minutes to collect whatever she could carry in the canvas bag slung over her left shoulder. Copper wiring was best. Steel brackets second. Aluminum cans if there was nothing else. She was 12 years old and she understood commodity pricing better than most adults. The Seattle winter had come in mean that year. December cold that didn't just chill. It pressed, like something trying to get inside you, like the weather had a personal grievance. The fog off Puget Sound rolled through the city in thick gray curtains, and by the time it settled over the south end of town where the scrapyard sat, you couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. Harper wore 2 layers under her school jacket, one pair of gloves with the right index finger cut off so she could feel what she was sorting through, and a wool hat pulled down to her eyebrows. Her breath came out in small white clouds. She thought about the electric bill. Evelyn had been coughing again, 3 nights now. That specific cough, low and wet, from deep in the chest, the kind that meant Harper needed to put extra blankets on before she left, and make sure the space heater was pointed toward the bedroom. The apartment on Delancey Street cost $480 a month, which wasn't the worst thing in the world, except that the boiler was broken and had been broken since September. And the landlord, a man named Garrett, who communicated exclusively through voicemails he never answered himself, had stopped returning calls in October. Evelyn was 63 years old. She'd worked her entire life. A cafeteria cook, a laundry attendant, briefly a home health aide before her own knees started betraying her. She hadn't asked to become a guardian. She'd become one anyway. Harper didn't think about that too often. The gratitude was too big to look at directly. It sat in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed, smooth and permanent and always there. She found a good coil of copper wire near the back of the lot, behind a stack of engine blocks that had been sitting long enough to grow moss at the base. She worked quickly, coiling it tight and pressing it into the bottom of the bag. Checked her watch, the cheap digital one from the dollar store that lost about 4 minutes a day, which meant she was always running a calculation in her head, always adjusting. 4:51, give or take. She was turning to move on when she heard it. It was faint at first. She thought it was an animal, a cat maybe, or something caught underneath one of the car stacks. The scrapyard had feral cats. She'd fed one last spring with half a granola bar. But as she moved deeper into the fog, closer to the far southeast corner where the vehicles too wrecked to be individually cataloged were piled 2 and 3 high in rows, the sound resolved itself into something unmistakably human. Banging, rhythmic and desperate, metal on metal. Then, muffled through steel and insulation, a voice. Harper stopped walking. Every instinct she had said to turn around. Those instincts were good instincts. They'd kept her functional in a world that didn't particularly concern itself with 12-year-old girls who sorted scrap metal before school. Don't get involved in other people's problems. Move fast. Stay invisible. Don't give anyone a reason to look at you twice. She took one step back toward the gap in the fence. The banging came again. Harder this time, with a quality of absolute desperation that she felt in her molars, in the base of her sternum, in some deep part of her that had been trained by years of hard living to recognize genuine distress from performance. That was not performance. She moved toward it. The sound was coming from a sedan, an older model, maybe mid-90s, dark blue or black, impossible to tell in the dark and fog. It had been pushed into the far corner of the lot, partially hidden behind a wall of compressed steel cubes. The kind of car you'd put somewhere you didn't want found. The kind of car someone had put there deliberately. The trunk lock had been damaged. Not broken open, but jammed from the outside. Something wedged through the latch mechanism, Harper saw when she got close enough. A piece of bent rebar, threaded through in a way that would require a tool or very specific leverage to remove. Whoever had put the person in that trunk had thought about it. Harper looked around. No movement in the fog. No flashlight beam from Delmar's rounds. She set down her bag, pulled the crescent wrench from her jacket pocket. She always carried a crescent wrench, for the same reason some people carried umbrellas, and worked the rebar free in less than 90 seconds. The trunk swung open. The man inside tried to sit up and couldn't. He was big. That was the first thing she registered, because the trunk had held him folded at angles that would have broken something in a smaller person. His hands were zip-tied behind his back. His face was a map of recent violence, left eye swollen nearly shut, a cut across his cheekbone that had bled through a makeshift pressure bandage made from what looked like a torn sleeve, a bruise at his jawline the color of a thundercloud. He was wearing a leather vest over a dark Henley, and even zip-tied and broken open in the trunk of an abandoned car, there was something in his physical presence that pushed back against the darkness around him. His remaining good eye found her. "Hey," he said. His voice was gravel dragged across concrete. "Hey," Harper said. She was already looking at the zip ties. Her wrench wasn't the right tool for that. She checked her jacket pockets. The small folding knife she carried for cutting copper tubing, 4 inches, wasn't going to cut through industrial zip ties cleanly, but she could saw if she had to. "Kid," the man said, "you need to. I'm getting you out. Hold still." He held still. She worked the blade against the plastic, angling for the thickest part of the mechanism rather than the band itself. It took 2 minutes, and her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from something else she didn't name. The zip tie gave. He brought his arms forward slowly. She could see from the way he did it that his shoulders had been locked back long enough that movement genuinely hurt. He sat up in the trunk. Then he looked at her. Really looked. Not the way adults usually looked at her. Through her, or past her, or at her with that particular brand of tired adult assessment that calculated usefulness and liability simultaneously. He looked at her face, and something happened to his expression that she didn't have language for. His whole body went still. "Your face," he said. His voice had changed. Something in it had... She couldn't identify what exactly, only that it reminded her of the sound ice makes when it starts cracking under weight. Harper took a step back. "What?" He was staring at the scar. She knew he was staring at the scar because everyone stared at the scar eventually, though most people were more subtle about it. The crescent-shaped one near her left temple, thin and precise, a pale curve against her brown skin. She'd had it as long as she could remember. Evelyn said she'd had it when they found her. "How old are you?" he asked. 12. She picked up her bag. "You should probably get out of the yard before the watchman comes around." "What's your name?" But she was already moving, already pulling the fog around herself like a coat, already doing the thing she was best at, disappearing into the spaces between things, into the gray air and the pre-dawn darkness, until the sounds of the scrapyard swallowed the sound of her boots on the gravel, and there was nothing left of her but the impression she'd made. She didn't look back. She had a bus to catch. The apartment on Delancey Street was 3 rooms on the second floor of a building that had been optimistically described in the rental listing as vintage character. What it had was thin walls, a window in the bathroom that didn't fully close, a kitchen where 2 of the 4 burners worked, and a landlord who treated the building's chronic failures as personal affronts to his dignity rather than his professional responsibility. Evelyn was awake when Harper got back. She was always awake before Harper got back, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea that had gone cold, The reading glasses she'd had for 6 years sitting on the bridge of her nose, even though the prescription had stopped being accurate about 3 years ago. She looked up when the door opened. "Good morning," Harper said. "You're cold," Evelyn said. "It's December." "There's oatmeal on the stove." Harper set her bag down, pulled off her hat and gloves, and sat across from Evelyn at the table that was too big for the kitchen it lived in. A table that had been Evelyn's mother's and had moved with her through 4 apartments across 28 years. The oatmeal was thick with brown sugar. Harper ate it standing at the stove because sitting down felt like stopping, and stopping felt dangerous on mornings like this. "How much?" Evelyn asked. "Good morning first," Harper said. "I already said good morning. How much?" "Copper coil, maybe 3 pounds. Steel bracket." She calculated. $12. Maybe 13. Evelyn's expression didn't change. She had the face of someone who had stopped being surprised by the gap between what was needed and what was available, who had reached a peace with that gap that wasn't happiness, but was something more durable than despair. She reached across the table and squeezed Harper's wrist once and let go. "Electric bill is due Thursday," she said. "I know." "I talked to Marta about extra hours at the diner. She said maybe next week." "Okay. You're going to be late for school." Harper looked at the clock. She wasn't going to be late. She was never late for school. School was warm and had books and a librarian named Miss Okafor who let her stay in the library during lunch without asking why she wasn't in the cafeteria. School was, by certain metrics, the best part of her day. She rinsed her bowl, pulled her bag back onto her shoulder, and paused at the door. "There was someone in the scrapyard," she said. "In a trunk." Evelyn's mug stopped moving toward her lips. "Someone." "A man. He was hurt. I cut him free." The silence that followed had several layers. "Harper." "He's fine. Probably. He seemed like he could walk." "You don't know that man." "I know he was zip-tied in a trunk in the cold." She held the door open. That felt like enough. She left before Evelyn could answer, because sometimes the right thing to do and the safe thing to do were different, and she'd made her peace with that before she even knew there was a word for it. His name was Jace Maddox, and he was 41 years old, and he had been in worse situations than that trunk, though not many. He drove himself to the emergency room on the northwest side, told them he'd been jumped, and sat in a plastic chair for 3 hours while they cleaned the cut on his face and told him his ribs were bruised but not broken. He didn't file a report. He gave a false name to the intake nurse and a false address and left before the attending physician made his second round. He called Priest from the parking lot. Priest, real name Marcus Webb, had been his second for 6 years with the Iron Remnant MC, which had chapters in Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland, and a reputation that preceded it into rooms where the actual members hadn't yet arrived. Not the reputation the movies made up. The other kind. The kind earned in free legal clinics and veterans assistance networks, and the particular gray zone where people who had fallen completely through the official safety net found themselves standing, blinking, looking around for something solid to hold on to. "You're alive," Priest said. "Yeah." "Took you long enough to call." "I was in a trunk for 6 hours." "Then you've had worse nights." A pause. And then the texture of Priest's voice changed in the way it always did when he dropped the performance of casual. "Varro's people. Who else?" Dominic Varro had been a problem for the Iron Remnant for the better part of 3 years. Not a rival club. Varro didn't operate like that. Didn't want colors or territory in the traditional sense. He wanted leverage. He ran the kind of operation that existed in the margins of legitimate industries. Stolen vehicle networks, construction fraud, the specific and lucrative business of being the person other people paid to make problems disappear. He and the Iron Remnant had been in conflict since the club had intervened, decisively, and in a way Varro considered an insult, in the attempted displacement of a tent community the previous winter. Varro had a long memory and apparently unlimited patience. "Come to the house," Priest said. "Tomorrow. I need tonight." Another pause. "Jace." "Tomorrow, Marcus." He sat in the parking lot until his hands stopped shaking. Then he drove the long way home, through the south end, past the scrapyard. He didn't stop. He just drove past it slowly. The headlights of the Harley cutting through the fog, The engine a low pulse under him that had always been the closest thing he had to a heartbeat he could feel outside his own chest. He drove past the scrapyard and tried not to think about the scar. Mia Maddox had been 10 years old when the flood came. It was the kind of thing that happened in places where water was already present, already part of the landscape. The Columbia River watershed, spring snowmelt, a system of levees that everyone in state government had known for a decade were insufficient and no one had wanted to fund repairing. The flood warnings came 48 hours early. Most people left. Some people couldn't. Some people waited too long. Jace had been in Portland for a club meeting. He'd called Renata, his wife, Mia's mother, his person for 11 years. And she'd said they were fine. The warnings were being excessive. She'd have everything ready to leave by morning. He'd said he'd be home by midnight. The water came at 10:45. By the time he got back, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. The house, a small place by a tributary stream that had always been charming in summer and slightly anxious-making in spring, was gone. Renata was found the next morning. She'd made it to the second floor. The water had made it there too. They never found Mia. They searched for 6 weeks. They dragged the waterways. They checked hospitals in 4 counties. They followed every lead, every reported sighting, every well-meaning neighbor who thought they'd seen something. Nothing. The official designation came after 3 months. Missing, presumed deceased. Jace had not accepted the word presumed. He had not accepted it for 2 years. He had ridden every road in western Washington. He had put her picture in every diner and truck stop from the Oregon border to the Canadian crossing. He had done everything a man could do and watched all of it produce nothing, and had arrived at a place that wasn't acceptance and wasn't hope either. A gray middle ground where he kept breathing and kept moving because the club needed him and because stopping felt like surrender, and surrender was the one thing left he was still refusing to do. The scar. Mia had gotten the scar at 7 years old, falling off a bike. Crescent-shaped, near her left temple, a pale curve against brown skin, identical to his own skin, because she'd gotten his coloring, his hair, his stubborn line of jaw that Renata had always complained about and secretly loved. He lay in his apartment that night, a spare place above a garage near Ballard, stripped down to essentials, the accumulated detritus of grief, which was mostly just the absence of anything that wasn't necessary, and stared at the ceiling. 12 years old. Mia would be 12 now. He told himself that meant nothing. The scar was a common enough shape. Crescent scars happened. The world was full of 12-year-old girls with dark skin and watchful eyes and the kind of early competence that spoke of hard childhoods. It meant nothing. He stared at the ceiling for 6 hours and did not sleep. He went back to the scrapyard the next morning. He didn't tell himself why. He didn't examine it too closely. He drove there in the blue pre-dawn dark, parked the Harley outside the fence, and waited with a coffee from the gas station down the block. She didn't come. He went back the next day, and the day after that. On the 4th morning, he brought a paper bag from the bakery on Clement Street. Cinnamon rolls, which he bought on instinct and then spent the drive over feeling stupid about because he didn't know if this girl liked cinnamon rolls. Didn't know anything about her except her face and her quick hands and the way she'd cut him free without explanation and disappeared before he could even say thank you. He left the bag on top of the fence post nearest the chain link gap. When he came back the following morning, the bag was gone. He left food every day after that. He didn't wait. He just left it and drove away. A week passed. The food was always gone when he came back. He started leaving notes, short ones, on folded paper tucked under the bag. Nothing heavy. He wasn't capable of heavy in the mornings. Just, I don't know your name. I owe you one. J. And, hope you're warm. And, the cinnamon rolls were from Clement Street Bakery. The almond ones are better, but I figured you might prefer options. On the morning of the 9th day, he was sitting outside the fence with his coffee when a voice came from behind him. You're going to get cited for loitering. He turned around. She was standing 6 feet away, hands in her jacket pockets, watching him with an expression that contained several things he recognized: assessment, suspicion, the specific wariness of someone who had learned through experience that kindness usually had a price. But there was something else there, too, underneath those things. Something that might have been, under different circumstances, curiosity. Morning, he said. "You've been coming here every day." "Yeah." "Why?" He thought about that. He'd had 9 days to prepare for this question, and he still didn't have an answer that was simple. "I wanted to say thank you," he said, which was true, and also not the whole truth. She looked at him for a long moment. "You're better," she said. It wasn't a question. "Ribs are still a problem, nothing broken." "The cut on your face healed fast." "Yeah." He held out the coffee cup. "You want this? I've barely touched it." She didn't take it. "I don't take things from people I don't know." "Harper," he said. She went still. "The man who runs this yard, Delmar. He told me your name after I described you." He looked at her carefully. "I'm Jace." "I know who you are," she said. And the way she said it was strange. Not the recognition of someone who'd researched him, but something different. Something like she was choosing how much of what she knew to say. He waited. "Iron Remnant," she said. "Your patch. I looked it up when I got to school. You ride out of the shop on Meridian Avenue. You do the veteran food drive in November. My teacher's brother got legal help from someone at your club last year." He blinked. "You looked me up." "I cut a stranger out of a car trunk." "Yes, I looked you up." There was a long pause. A garbage truck 2 streets over ground through its early morning circuit. A crow somewhere in the fog made a sound like a rusty hinge. "Smart," Jace said. "Obviously," Harper said. And that was it. That was how it started. Not with revelation, not with drama, but with 2 people standing outside a chain-link fence in the December cold, both of them carrying more than they were showing, both of them too careful to show it. She came back to the fence the next morning, and the morning after that. She took the coffee once, 2 hands around the cup, eyes closed for just a second when the warmth hit her palms, then open and watchful again immediately. She never let her guard down for more than a moment. But she came back. Priest saw it on Jace's face the first time he came back to the clubhouse. The Iron Remnant chapter house occupied what had been a light industrial warehouse off the south waterfront, a building that had been purchased through 7 years of legitimate business income and renovated by the members themselves into something that was part community center, part safe house, part home. There was a commercial kitchen that ran free meals 3 evenings a week. There was a room with 10 cots for emergency use. There were motorcycles, always motorcycles, in various states of assembly and restoration in the main bay. The men who made up the chapter were not young. They were the kind of men who had been through things. Specific, definable things that had left marks the way all real experience left marks. Combat veterans, most of them. A few who'd lost businesses or families to circumstances that had seemed, at the time, like personal failures but turned out to be systemic ones. Men who'd been through the machine of American institutional life and come out the other side with a particular kind of clarity that the institutions were not coming, that the safety nets were decorative, that if you wanted to protect someone, you had to be the protection yourself. They were loud and they were profane, and 3 of them were in therapy. They raised money for a children's hospital every spring and rode honor guard at military funerals twice a month, and had collectively logged more volunteer hours at the VA than the paid staff in some departments. They were not gangsters. They were something harder to explain. Priest watched Jace come through the door and sit down at the end of the long table in the main room and wrap both hands around a mug of coffee and not say anything. He sat down across from him. "Talk," Priest said. "The girl who found me. The kid from the scrapyard. She has Mia's scar." Priest was quiet for a moment. "Jace, I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not saying it's her. I know the math. I know what the official finding was. I'm not losing my mind. Okay? But she has Mia's scar, exact same spot, same shape. She's 12. She's—" He put the mug down. "She has Mia's coloring. She has this way of tilting her head when she's thinking about something. Mia used to do that. Renata always said she got it from me, but she didn't. She got it from herself." Priest said nothing. "She likes the stars," Jace said. "I found out yesterday. She was telling me about her science class, and she mentioned they'd done a unit on constellations, and her face—" He pressed his mouth together. "Her whole face changed." "Jace?" "I know." He picked the mug back up, set it down again. I know. The fire in the corner of the room popped and settled. Outside, through the high industrial windows, the Seattle winter pressed its gray weight against the glass. The guardian, Priest said finally. The older woman. You know anything? Not yet. She works at a diner on Pine. That's all I have. You want me to? No! He said it fast, then caught himself. Not yet. Let me... He looked at his hands. Let me not ruin this. Priest studied him for a long time. He had known Jace Maddox for 11 years, had watched him go from a man with a family to a man with a ghost, too. Gradually, over the 2 years since the flood, a man who functioned, who got up and came in and rode and worked and did the things that needed doing, and never talked about it, but also never quite arrived back at himself. Not all the way. You be careful, Priest said. With yourself. Always. I mean it, Jace. Don't let yourself... I know. He did know. The trap was obvious enough, the way all the worst traps were obvious. He knew what wishful thinking looked like. He'd spent 2 years learning its texture, learning to recognize the way grief shaped itself into things that looked like evidence. He knew the risk. But the scar was the scar, and the math was 12. And somewhere in a bad apartment with a broken boiler, a girl who tilted her head the way only one person in his experience had ever tilted her head was doing her homework before school. He picked up his coffee and drank it. The money problem did not get better. It got slightly worse in the specific incremental way that money problems tended to get worse for people who had no margin, where each unexpected expense was not a setback, but a structural failure. The boiler in Evelyn's building went from broken to completely inoperable in the 3rd week of December. Temperatures dropped to 19 degrees 2 nights running. They heated the apartment with the oven and the space heater and extra blankets and Evelyn's body heat, which at 63 and with the developing chest cold she wouldn't admit to having, was not a reliable resource. Harper did not tell Jace about the boiler. She did not tell him because she did not tell people things she thought they might feel obligated to fix. He found out anyway. It took him 48 hours after she mentioned, offhand, that she'd been staying at the library later than usual because the studying was easier there. Libraries, he knew from long experience, were warm. He didn't say anything directly. He went to Priest. The Iron Remnant had a network. It was the most accurate word for it, a web of relationships and favors and resources accumulated over years of operating in the specific gray zone where formal institutions ran out of road. They knew landlords, and they knew inspectors, and they knew the specific telephone numbers of code enforcement officers who answered their phones when certain people called. Garrett, the landlord on Delancey Street, received a code enforcement inspection request on a Tuesday morning that mentioned specifically the boiler. He also received, through channels Jace never described in detail, a reminder that operating a residential rental property in violation of habitation codes was the kind of thing that attracted a particular kind of prolonged regulatory attention. The boiler was repaired by Thursday, Harper noticed. She didn't say anything for 2 days, and then one morning she came to the fence and looked at him for a long time before speaking. The boiler got fixed, she said. That's good, he said. Garrett called Evelyn himself. First time he's called in months. Huh. Jace. He met her eyes. She had Mia's eyes. He couldn't stop arriving at this observation because it kept being true. The specific dark brown of them, with the slight upturn at the outer corners that was all her own regardless of who she was, had always been all her own. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. I didn't ask you to do that. I know that too. She looked at him for another long moment. Something moved across her face that she didn't quite manage to contain. Something that was gratitude and resentment and relief all mixed together. The specific emotional compound of someone who was not accustomed to being helped and didn't know what to do with it. Thank you, she finally said. You cut me out of a trunk in the dark, he said. We're not even close to even. She almost smiled. Almost. She looked away at the scrapyard instead, and they stood there in the cold for a moment. Not talking. The fog moving through the crushed car towers, a seagull making its Arctic sound somewhere above the warehouse district, and Jace held himself very still and did not push, because he was learning her the way she needed space built around any offering before she could accept it. He was learning her the way he had learned Mia. The thought arrived without warning and landed in his chest like a stone thrown through ice, and he stood there breathing carefully in the cold morning and did not let his face change. The men hunting Jace Maddox were not careless. That was the problem. Dominic Vero was not a man who operated emotionally. He was patient in the way of people who had built systems rather than relationships, who thought in infrastructure rather than individuals. The kidnapping had been a message more than an execution. He'd wanted Jace frightened, wanted the Iron Remnant aware of exposure, wanted a negotiating position. When the message failed to arrive, when Jace walked out of that trunk and went to an emergency room and then to his club and proceeded to behave as if nothing had changed, Vero recalibrated. He sent a man named Trask to gather information. Trask was competent in the anonymous way of people paid to be competent, a tall man in a gray jacket who sat in coffee shops with laptops and moved through neighborhoods without drawing attention. He spent a week in the South End. He watched the Meridian Avenue shop. He watched the waterfront clubhouse. He watched Jace Maddox's movements with the methodical patience of someone who understood that patterns were always there. You just had to look long enough. He saw the fence. He saw the girl. He didn't know what it meant yet. But he wrote it down because Trask's job was to write down what he saw and let other people decide what it meant. He sent the report to Vero on a Friday evening. He included a photograph. Harper was in the school library when it happened. Not the thing itself, but the beginning of the thing, the first loose thread that would pull everything apart. She was doing homework at one of the tables near the windows, her backpack on the floor beside her, Ms. Okafor somewhere in the stacks putting returned books away with the quiet, systematic efficiency of someone who had found their life's exact work. She was reading a chapter on river systems for Earth science, the Columbia watershed, ironically, the specific hydrology of the Pacific Northwest. And there was a photograph in the textbook of a floodplain in winter, gray water spreading out over fields and roads, and something happened when she looked at it. Not a memory exactly. More like the ghost of one. A sensation rather than an image. Cold water, the sound of something roaring, a feeling in her chest like falling, and underneath all of it, further down than she could get to, something calling her name in a voice she didn't recognize. She sat very still. The sensation passed. Miss Okafor appeared at her shoulder to return a book to the shelf above the table. "You okay, sweetheart?" "Yeah," Harper said. "I'm fine." She looked back at the textbook, the photograph of the floodplain. She turned the page. She was fine. She was always fine. She had always been fine, and there was a careful system built around that fineness, a scaffolding of routine and practical focus, and not looking too hard at the places that hurt. And it worked. It had always worked. She turned the page and kept reading. But that night, in the apartment with the newly repaired boiler, she lay in the dark with her eyes open and listened to the sound of Evelyn's breathing in the next room and tried to remember something she wasn't sure she'd ever known. The water. The sound of something calling her name. The voice she didn't recognize. She was almost asleep when she realized why the voice felt strange. It wasn't that she didn't recognize it. It was that she'd been hearing it differently. Hearing it the way memory distorts things, the way water distorts sound. The voice wasn't a stranger's voice. It was just the voice of someone she'd been trying not to hear for 2 years. She didn't know whose voice it was. But she felt, in the particular pre-sleep way of things felt rather than thought, that she was getting closer to finding out. She told Jace about the flood thing the next morning. She hadn't planned to. Came out sideways, the way things did when she'd been carrying them too long. She was talking about the Earth Science Project, about the Columbia watershed, and then she was describing the photograph, and then she was describing the sensation, and then she was standing at the fence looking at her own hands, and not quite understanding how she'd gotten from point A to point B. Jace was very still. She looked up at him. His face was doing the thing it sometimes did, the thing she'd cataloged over weeks of watching him, the way it went very carefully neutral when something she said landed somewhere in him that he didn't want her to see. He was good at the neutral face, but not quite good enough. "What?" she said. "Nothing." "Jace, it sounds like a memory," he said, very carefully. "I don't have memories from before I was 10. Evelyn says—" She stopped. He waited. Evelyn says she found me, Harper said, when I was about 10, after a flood. I didn't remember anything. I still don't. The silence between them was the loudest thing in the scrapyard, louder than the machinery starting up in the distance, louder than the trucks on the access road, louder than the crow in the tower of compressed steel. Jace put his coffee down on the fence post. Harper, he said. Don't, she said. I'm not saying. I know you're not saying it. Her voice was steady in the way things were steady when you applied force to keep them that way. I know. I know there's something you think. I've known for a while that there's something. She met his eyes. I'm not ready, okay? Whatever it is. I'm not ready. He looked at her for a long time like, okay, he said. Okay? Yeah. He picked up his coffee. Tell me about the watershed project. She looked at him for another moment. This man who had appeared in her life out of the trunk of an abandoned car. This man who brought her food and fixed her boiler and stood in the cold with her every morning and looked at her like she was something he'd been looking for and felt something in her chest that the careful scaffolding was not quite able to hold. It's for Friday, she said. I'm doing a section on floodplain management. Tell me, he said. She told him. And somewhere on the other side of the city, a man named Trask photographed them through a chain-link fence and added the image to a file he was building for a man named Vero, a man who had decided that the quickest way to send a message to Jace Maddox was no longer to come for Jace Maddox himself. The quickest way was to come for something he cared about. Trask zoomed in on the girl at the fence. He sent the photograph. He closed his laptop and left his coffee half-finished. Outside, the Seattle winter continued its gray, patient work, pressing down on everything, and in the distance, somewhere, a Harley engine started up. Low and rolling, the sound of something large and alive, and moved through the fog toward the south end, and Harper Quinn, standing at a chain-link fence with a man she was beginning to understand she did not know how to be afraid of, tilted her head in the way that was entirely her own and asked a question about river systems. And Jace Maddox, who had not slept through the night in 2 years, felt something shift in his chest like a tide beginning to turn. He answered her question. He did not look at his phone where a text from Priest waited. 2 words, urgent and cold as the winter morning, that would change everything. They know. The text had been sitting on his phone for 11 minutes before Jace read it. He knew it had been 11 minutes because he'd checked the timestamp twice. Once when he finally looked at the screen after Harper had walked away toward the bus stop, her canvas bag over one shoulder, her wool hat pulled down to her eyebrows, moving through the morning fog with the particular purposeful stride of someone who had learned early that hesitation cost you. And once again, stupidly, as if the number might have changed. They know. 2 words from Priest and Jace felt the whole architecture of the last 3 weeks shift under him, felt the careful structure he'd been building. The fence, the coffee, the mornings, the slow, patient work of earning the trust of a girl who trusted nothing, felt all of it become suddenly, acutely fragile. He called Priest back before he'd even started the Harley. How long? He said when the line picked up. Don't know yet. Priest's voice was flat in the way it got when he was working to keep it flat, when the effort of control was audible underneath the surface. Boone spotted a tail yesterday. White Civic, different driver than the day before, same plates. He ran them, registered to a shell company out of Tacoma. Vero. Has to be. Jace looked at the fence, at the chain-link gap where Harper's canvas bag had scraped the edge of the post on her way through, where she came and went every morning like a fixture, like she had always been there. They've been watching the yard, he said. Silence for 3 seconds. Jace, tell me they haven't been watching the yard. I don't know what they've been watching. He closed his eyes, the cold pressed against his face. Somewhere in the fog above the scrapyard, the crow made its metal hinge sound again, and he stood in the gravel and felt something very like fear, which was not an emotion he spent much time with, but which he recognized immediately when it arrived, because it always felt the same way it had always felt. Not fear for himself, but fear for something outside himself, something he didn't have the right words for yet, but which had been building in him for 3 weeks, like water behind a wall. Bring everyone in, he said. Tonight. The house. Already done. 7 o'clock. A pause. And Jace, whatever you're thinking about the girl, 7 o'clock, Jace said, and hung up. He sat on the Harley for a moment without starting it. The engine was cold under him, all that capacity for motion held still, waiting. He looked at the fence, at the gap, at the fog curling through the towers of crushed metal like something alive and purposeless. He started the bike. He drove toward the bus stop. He got there in time to see Harper's bus pulling away, and he sat at the light and watched it go. And told himself it was fine. It was morning. She was on her way to school. She was 12 years old, and she'd been taking care of herself since before she knew him, and she would be fine. He told himself that. He turned the Harley toward Meridian Avenue and opened the throttle and let the engine speak for him, loud enough to drown the thing building in his chest. The shop on Meridian Avenue was called Remnant Ironworks, which was partially a fabrication business and partially a front for nothing in particular, and mostly just what it appeared to be. A motorcycle repair and restoration workshop that operated on legitimate margins in a legitimate commercial space and happened to be owned by a man who wore a cut and had complicated feelings about the institutional definition of the law. Cutter was there when Jace arrived, deep in the undercarriage of a 1982 shovelhead that someone had brought in from Olympia in a trailer because they'd heard Cutter was the best in the state at pre-AMF era restorations, which he was, and which he would tell you himself without embarrassment if you asked. He looked up when the door opened. Cutter was 54 and had the face of a man who had made peace with what the face of a 54-year-old man looked like. He had a gray beard that he kept precise and hands that were permanently stained with grease in the creases even when he'd scrubbed them, and he'd done 2 tours in a desert a long time ago that he referenced exactly never. He was the best mechanic in the chapter and the worst liar, and the only person in the Iron Remnant who Jace had genuinely leaned on in the months after the flood. He looked at Jace's face for about 2 seconds. "How bad?" he said. "Vero's been running surveillance." Jace pulled off his jacket and hung it on the hook by the door. "We don't know for how long." Cutter set down his wrench. "The girl." It wasn't a question. Jace had told Cutter about Harper. Not the scar, not the specific weight of it, but enough. Cutter had the quality of a man who heard what wasn't said. "I don't know if they've seen her," Jace said, "but she's at the fence every morning. She's—" He stopped. "She's visible." Cutter picked the wrench back up, turned it in his hands without using it. "You talked to Evelyn?" "Not yet." "Jace." "I know." "The woman doesn't know what she's sitting next to. If Vero's people make a calculation about leverage—" "I know, Cutter." The shop was warm in the specific way of spaces where engines were always running or had recently run, where the heat was mechanical and constant and smelled of oil and metal. Somewhere in the back, a radio was playing something old and scratchy, country, the kind from before it became something else. The familiar smell of it, the familiar warmth, pressed against Jace's shoulders and the base of his neck, and he stood in the middle of it and felt, underneath the logistics and the threat assessment, something that he hadn't felt in 2 years and didn't know how to handle. He felt like he had somewhere to be. "I need you to run something for me," he said. "Quiet." Cutter met his eyes. "Flood records. 2 years ago, Western Washington. Missing persons, specifically children, between the ages of 9 and 12. He kept his voice level. "I need to know if there was an unidentified girl, found by a civilian, not placed in state custody." The wrench stopped moving in Cutter's hands. "Jace," he said slowly, "I know how it sounds. It doesn't sound like anything. That's what worries me. I know. Have you considered the possibility that you're—" "Every day," Jace said. "Run it anyway." Cutter set the wrench down on the workbench. He pulled a rag from his back pocket and wiped his hands in the slow, deliberate way of someone buying himself time to think. Then he nodded once. "It'll take a couple days." "Okay." "And Jace." He waited until Jace looked at him. "Whatever it comes back as. You have to be ready for what it comes back as." "Yeah," Jace said. He picked his jacket back up and walked out into the cold. The meeting at the chapter house that evening was attended by 11 men and held in the main room around the long table. with the fire going in the corner and the kind of light that only existed in spaces where people had been gathering for a long time. Warm and specific and slightly amber, the light of accumulated meetings, of decisions made and kept. Priest stood at the head of the table. He was a tall man, Marcus Webb, with a stillness to him that people sometimes mistook for calm, and which was actually something more precise than calm. It was the quality of a man who had learned, through specific experience, to move only when movement was necessary and to mean everything he moved. He'd gotten the name priest in the army, where it had been meant ironically. He'd kept it because irony, like most things, had a way of becoming true if you wore it long enough. He laid out what they knew, which was not much. Surveillance, at least one vehicle confirmed, at least 2 operators. The Meridian shop as a probable target of observation. Duration unknown. Vero's likely objective. The same thing it had always been. Pressure, leverage, a renegotiation of the terms under which the Iron Remnant operated in the South End. "He wants us scared," said Boone, who was 38 and had the compact, deliberate energy of someone who had processed a great deal of violence and arrived at a very specific philosophy about it. "He wants us to come to the table." "He wants us to come to the table with nothing," said Priest. "That's different." "So we don't go to the table." "That's one option." "What's the other option?" said a man named Dell, who was 51 and owned a hardware store on weekdays and had never been in the military and had been with the chapter for 9 years, and whose presence in the room always reminded Jace that the Iron Remnant was not a veterans organization with a bike problem, but a community with a protection deficit, which was a different thing. Priest looked at Jace. The room looked at Jace. He'd been sitting at the far end of the table with his arms crossed and his coffee going cold in front of him, running the geometry of it in his head. Vero's patience, the probable timeline, what leverage meant when it wasn't abstract. "There's a woman and a kid in the South End," Jace said. "They're not club. They have nothing to do with club business." He said it flat and watched the room take it in. "Vero's people have been watching my movements," he said. "I've been going to a scrapyard on Delancey every morning for 3 weeks." He paused. "If they've put together a connection between me and the people at that address, then we move them," Priest said. Immediate, no deliberation. "They don't know they need moving. Then we tell them." "The woman is 63 with a bad chest cold and a 12-year-old she's responsible for." He looked at Priest. "I can't walk up to her and say your landlord fixed your boiler and now your address might be in the hands of a man who kidnapped me." "You also can't leave them exposed," Boone said. "I know what I can't do." His voice had an edge and he heard it and didn't pull it back. "I need options that aren't terrifying 2 people who've already been through enough." The silence that followed had the texture of men thinking, rather than men withholding. This was part of what Jace had always valued about the chapter. The way the room held problems without immediately needing to resolve them. The willingness to sit inside difficulty rather than flinch away. "The Pendleton property," said Dell. Everyone looked at him. "My cousin's place on Ravenna. She went to her daughter's in Phoenix for the winter. 3-bedroom, good locks, corner unit." He shrugged in the deliberate way of a man who shrugged deliberately. "She asked me to check on it twice a week anyway." Jace looked at Priest. "We'd need to make it voluntary," Priest said. "They'd need to understand what they were agreeing to." "I know. And they'd need to trust you enough to agree." The fire popped in the corner. Outside, one of the bikes that had been parked on the street started up and then cut out, someone testing an electrical issue, the engine sound rising and falling like a question without an answer. Jace looked at his cold coffee. "I'll talk to Evelyn," he said. He said it like it was simple. Everyone at the table was polite enough not to point out that it wasn't. Borsicht. He went to the diner on Pine Street the next morning at 7 because he knew from Harper that Evelyn's shift started at 7:30 and she walked there from the apartment, which meant she left at 7:15 and he could catch her on the street. He caught her half a block from the building, a woman in a dark coat with the collar turned up, moving with the deliberate economy of someone whose knees hurt but who had decided long ago not to make a performance of it. She saw him coming. She stopped. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that he couldn't fully read. Assessment, the same wariness Harper had, which told him something about where Harper had learned it. And then she said, You're the biker. Yes, ma'am. Harper told me about you. She studied him with eyes that had the quality of having seen a great deal and retained all of it. She told me you fixed the boiler. I made a call. She didn't move toward him or away. She also told me you look at her like she's something you lost. The cold pressed against his face. A bus went past on Pine, close enough that the draft of it moved his jacket. Evelyn, he said. You have 5 minutes before I'm late, she said. Talk. He talked. He kept it as clean as he could. The kidnapping, Vero, the surveillance, the probability that the address on Delancey Street had been observed. He did not say anything about Harper. He was not ready to say anything about Harper to this woman who had raised her, who stood in the cold with her hands folded in front of her and listened to him with an expression that didn't change throughout, which was either great control or great experience, and he suspected it was both. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You're telling me that your trouble has come to my door, she said. I'm telling you it may have. Through no fault of my own or Harper's. No fault of yours, he said. This is mine. I'm trying to put myself between it and you. She looked at him for a long time. Why? He didn't have the clean version of the answer, so he gave her the true one. Because Harper matters to me, and I don't... He stopped, started again. I haven't been careful enough about the lines between my life and hers. That's on me. I want to fix it. By moving us. By offering you somewhere safer while I resolve this. And if we say no, then I put security on the building. Discreet. You won't see them. He met her eyes. But I'd rather you and Harper were somewhere I knew was safe. Evelyn looked at him for another long moment, and in the silence he had the distinct and uncomfortable sensation of being evaluated with great precision by someone who was very good at it. I need to talk to Harper, she said. Of course. She makes her own decisions. I know. She's 12, but she makes her own decisions. That's not... She paused. That's not indulgence. That's respect. I understand. She studied him one more time, and then she nodded once, precise and final, and walked past him toward the diner. He stood on the sidewalk and watched her go, this small woman with the worn coat and the deliberate stride, and thought about the conversation she'd had with herself over 2 years about who Harper was and where she'd come from, and whether she'd arrived at questions she didn't let herself ask, and what it would mean when the answers came. He thought about all of it and stood on the cold sidewalk and said nothing. Harper said no. Not to moving. She said yes to moving because she was practical and pragmatic and understood threat assessment better than most adults Jace had ever met. She said no to something else. They were at the fence the next morning, and he'd explained the Ravenna apartment, the cousin, the winter vacancy, the better locks. And she'd listened with her arms crossed and her head tilted in the way that still caught him off guard every time. And when he finished, she said, Okay. Okay. Evelyn already said yes, so okay. She looked at him. But I want to know what you think I am. He was very still. Not right now, she said. Not today, but soon. She uncrossed her arms. Because I know you think something. I've known since the trunk, and I'm almost ready to hear it. She looked at the scrapyard, at the fog, at the crow that was almost certainly the same crow. I need it to come from you directly, not from me figuring it out around the edges. Harper, I mean it. I know you mean it. So promise me. He looked at her, this girl who had cut a stranger free in the dark and asked no questions, and then spent 3 weeks carefully, methodically figuring out exactly who he was and what he wanted and whether he was safe to be near, and felt something in his chest that was enormous and fragile and had no clean name. I promise, he said. She nodded, picked up her bag. Good. She walked toward the bus stop. He watched her go and thought, soon. Chab. They moved on a Thursday. The Ravenna apartment was on a corner in a quiet residential pocket near the University District, a neighborhood of old trees and covered porches and the specific Seattle quietness that existed between the rain. Dell's cousin had left it furnished and clean, and there was a small room at the back with a window that looked out on the alley where the building's old magnolia tree dropped leaves all year in varying quantities. Harper stood in the doorway of that room for a moment, her bag over her shoulder, looking at the window, at the tree. "This is fine," she said, which, from Harper, Jace was learning, was as close to "I like this" as she was likely to get. He helped them carry the boxes. There weren't many. Evelyn traveled light in the way of people who had moved many times, who knew which things were worth carrying and which weren't. Harper had 3 boxes: books, winter clothes, the earth science project she was still working on. Jace noticed she packed the books first. Boone drove past the block twice an hour for the first week. Jace didn't tell Evelyn about that. The information Cutter pulled came back 6 days later. He called on a Tuesday evening when Jace was at the shop alone, finishing a brake line on a customer's Road King, the work meditative and precise, his hands doing the thing his hands knew how to do, while the rest of him moved through a conversation he'd been having with himself for 3 weeks without resolution. "I found something," Cutter said. Jace set down the wrench. Flood records from 2 years ago, Lewis County. There were 11 unidentified persons processed through the emergency system in the immediate aftermath. He paused. 3 were children. Jace said nothing. 2 were processed through state channels within a week. Identified, family located. Another pause, longer this time. The 3rd. Female, estimated age 9 to 11, found unconscious on a riverbank by a private citizen approximately 36 hours after the flood event. No identification, no memory of name or family reported, significant head trauma. Jace was sitting on the floor of the shop without having decided to sit on the floor of the shop. The private citizen declined to contact state services, Cutter continued. She told the attending paramedic, this is in the EMS report, which is how I found it. She told him she'd take responsibility, that she knew the child. The paramedic flagged it as irregular, but the report went in without follow-up. "Evelyn," Jace said. "No name in the record." The paramedic was part of a volunteer unit, overwhelmed, moving fast. He logged the interaction and moved on. Cutter paused. "Jace, I heard you. This doesn't prove—" "I know. There were a lot of children displaced by that flood, a lot of head trauma cases. Memory loss is—" "Cutter," his voice came out very quiet. "I know." The shop around him was warm and still, the smell of oil, the smell of metal. The radio in the back playing something he couldn't identify. He sat on the floor of the shop with his back against the workbench and his wrists on his knees and looked at the brake line he'd been working on, the careful, precise work of a man who was good with his hands, who understood how systems fit together, how pressure moved through lines, how a failure in one place sent reverberations through everything connected to it. "I need to talk to Harper," he said. "You promised her you'd tell her." "I know I promised her." "So?" He closed his eyes. Mia Maddox, age 10, crescent scar near the left temple, loved stars, tilted her head when she was thinking, used to sit on the back of his Harley on summer mornings before anyone else was awake, just the 2 of them in the driveway in the early light, and look at the sky and name the clouds. "She needs to know," Cutter said. Not cruelly. Cutter was never cruel. He was just precise. "The longer you wait, I know. It's not fair to her. I know, Cutter." He opened his eyes. "I'm working on being fair. It's complicated." "It's always complicated. Do it anyway." He hung up. He sat on the floor for another few minutes. Then he stood up, picked up the wrench, and finished the brake line. Because the customer needed the bike by Thursday, and the work didn't stop being necessary just because the world had shifted underneath him. He finished the brake line. He turned off the lights. He sat in the dark shop for a moment and listened to the city outside. Traffic, wind, somewhere a Harley passing on the next block, the engine note familiar enough to be his own heartbeat. And then he pulled out his phone and sent Harper a text. "Can we talk tomorrow morning?" "Not at the fence. Somewhere with coffee and a table." Her response came back in 4 minutes. "Clement Street Bakery, 7 a.m. The almond ones better be there." He stared at that for a long moment. Something in his chest that was enormous and fragile and had no clean name. He put the phone in his pocket and drove home through the cold. He was at the bakery at 6:45. He ordered the almond rolls and a coffee for himself and a hot chocolate for Harper because he'd learned in small ways across 3 weeks that she preferred hot chocolate to coffee, but would drink coffee if it was there, and hot chocolate wasn't, which told him something about the hierarchy of her preferences and needs, about how she'd learned to want what was available rather than what she actually wanted. He thought about that a lot. She arrived at 7 exactly, which he was beginning to understand was her standard. She sat down across from him, pulled her hat off, and looked at the hot chocolate and then at him. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything," he said, which came out with more weight than he'd intended. And they both felt it, the way it sat between them on the table like something that had just been placed there and couldn't be put back. Harper looked at her hot chocolate. She wrapped both hands around the mug, the same gesture, the same closed eyes for just a second that she'd done with the coffee cup 3 weeks ago, the first time she'd accepted something from him. Then she looked up. "Tell me," she said. He told her. Not all of it. Not the flood? Not yet. He started with the scar. He described Mia's scar, the bike accident at 7, the pediatrician's note that he'd kept along with everything else in a box he hadn't been able to open for 2 years. He described the shape of it, the location. He watched Harper's face. Her face was doing something he hadn't seen before. It was going very still in a way that was different from her usual wariness. Not controlled, but frozen, the way water looks right at the edge of becoming ice. He told her about the flood records. He told her what Cutter had found. He kept his voice level because she deserved level, because she deserved information delivered without the weight of what he needed it to mean, because it had to be her truth before it was his. When he finished, she sat with her hands around the mug and looked at the table. The bakery was filling up around them. Morning regulars, a woman with a stroller, 2 men with laptops. The ordinary hum of a Tuesday morning in a city that didn't know or care what was happening at a corner table near the window. "You think I'm your daughter," Harper said. Her voice was very careful. "I think it's possible," he said. "I don't know. I don't want to—" He stopped. "I'm not asking you to believe it. I'm not asking you to feel anything about it. I'm asking you to let me find out." She looked up. Her eyes. He could not stop arriving at her eyes, the specific dark brown of them, the slight upturn at the outer corners. "How?" she said. "DNA test. Simple one. Results in a week." He held her gaze. "If it comes back negative, I never bring it up again. You tell me what happens to what we've already built here, and I respect it. And if it doesn't come back negative, then we figure out what that means together. You, me, Evelyn, nobody gets removed from anything. Nobody loses anybody." He put his hands flat on the table. "I need you to know that. Whatever this test says, you don't lose anything." She looked at his hands, at the table, at her hot chocolate, at him. "The scar," she said. "Yeah. I got mine in a flood. That's what Evelyn says. Debris in the water." "Yeah. And your daughter got hers on a bike." "Yeah. That's different. The shape is the same, the location is the same." He paused. "Head trauma can change the surface story of a wound. The EMS report mentions—" "Okay." She said it quietly and with a finality that stopped him. "Okay." She picked up her hot chocolate. She drank some of it. She set it down. "I'll do the test." He exhaled. He hadn't known he was holding his breath until he let it go. "But Jace—" She was looking at him very directly. "Whatever it says, I need you to know that I've been fine. I've been fine without knowing. I'm not—" Her voice, for the first time in his experience, lost its evenness. Fractional, quickly recovered. "I'm not broken. Whatever happened. I know you're not broken. I need you to treat me like I'm not broken. Harper." He said it as carefully as he knew how. "You are the least broken person I have ever met." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the Seattle winter pressed its face against the bakery window. Inside, the ordinary morning moved around them, unaware and unconcerned. He sat across from a 12-year-old girl who had cut him out of a trunk in the dark and asked nothing in return. who had rebuilt herself from nothing with a 63-year-old woman and a canvas bag and the specific fierce competence of someone who had decided that survival was enough and then kept going anyway. And he thought, whatever the test says, she is already something. She had always been something. Okay, she said. When? I can have a kit today. Today, she nodded. Okay. She picked up an almond roll and broke it in half and slid half toward him. Eat something. You look like you've been up since 4. 3, actually. Obviously, she said. And the tension broke just slightly at the edges, just enough for both of them to breathe. The results were supposed to take a week. They took 9 days because there was a processing backlog at the lab in Tacoma, which Jace discovered by calling them on day 7 and having a conversation with an administrative assistant that he was not proud of and which Priest later described, diplomatically, as vigorous. The kit went in on a Wednesday. By the following Thursday, Jace had called the lab 3 times, been asked twice to stop calling, and had spent 9 evenings sitting in the apartment above the Ballard garage with the specific sleeplessness of someone waiting for an answer they were terrified of in both directions. He didn't know which outcome terrified him more. If it came back negative, he had to relearn what he'd been looking at for 3 weeks. Had to reassemble the version of himself that existed without the possibility. The version that was just a man with a missing daughter and no path toward her. If it came back positive, he couldn't finish the sentence. There were too many things in it, too many years, too much that couldn't be returned. Renata, the house, the 12-year-old girl in the Ravenna apartment who had rebuilt herself into someone formidable and self-sufficient and was now going to have to rebuild herself again, differently. He thought about what that would require of her. He thought about it a lot. On the 9th day, at 6:47 in the evening, his phone rang. Lab number. He picked it up on the first ring and listened. He was sitting in the apartment above the Ballard garage, in the chair by the window, and outside the window the Seattle winter was doing its patient work, the dark coming earlier each day, the temperature down to 22, the first serious snow of the season beginning to fall in the slow, particular way it sometimes fell in this city. Sideways, then vertical, then sideways again, as if it hadn't decided yet. He listened. He said, "Say that again." The voice on the phone said it again. He set the phone down on the arm of the chair and sat in the dark apartment with the snow beginning on the window and his hands very still on his knees and tried to remember how to breathe. He was still sitting there 20 minutes later when his phone rang again. Different number. Evelyn's landline, which she still had because she'd had it for 30 years and had said once, flatly, that she was not getting rid of it, and that was the end of the discussion. He picked it up. "Mr. Maddox." Evelyn's voice. Something in it he'd never heard before. A crack in the precision, something underneath the surface. "She's remembering things." He stood up. "What things?" "She came out of her room 20 minutes ago. She sat down at the kitchen table." A pause. "She said she remembers motorcycles. She said she remembers a man who called her something." Another pause, longer. "She can't remember the word. She keeps trying to get to it and she can't." His throat closed. He already knew the word. He had called Mia that word since she was 4 years old. Since the first time he'd taken her outside in the early morning and laid her on the hood of the truck while it was still warm from driving and pointed up and named the stars for her, one by one, until she'd fallen asleep under the Orion belt and he'd carried her back inside and thought, "This is the whole thing, right here. This is every reason." Little stargazer. "Mr. Maddox," Evelyn said. "Are you there?" "I'm here," he said. "I'm coming." He was already moving toward the door, and behind him, in the dark apartment, his phone still sat on the arm of the chair where he'd left it, the screen lit with the last thing the lab technician had said before he'd set it down. "The samples are a match, Mr. Maddox. She's your daughter." Outside, the Harley started in the cold with a sound like something waking up. He pulled out of the garage and into the snow and opened the throttle, and the engine roared through the quiet street like something that had been waiting a long time to be given permission. He didn't know that Trask had been parked 2 blocks from the Ravenna apartment for the last 4 hours. He didn't know that Trask had photographed Evelyn's landline call in the window, the lit kitchen, the old woman standing with the phone to her ear and the child visible at the table behind her. He didn't know that Trask had already sent the photograph, that Varro had already looked at it, that Varro had already made the call, that Jace's worst fear, the leverage, the line between his life and everything that mattered, had just become... He made it to Ravenna in 11 minutes. The snow was coming harder now, not the sideways then vertical indecision of an hour ago, but committed, straight down, the kind of snow that meant it had finally made up its mind. The Harley's headlight cut through it in a narrow cone, the flakes coming at him like static, like interference, like the world trying to blur itself at the edges. He ran 2 yellow lights and one that was definitively red and didn't think about it. He thought about the word match. He thought about the word remembering. He turned onto the Ravenna block and killed the throttle and coasted the last half of the street without the engine, which was instinct more than decision, the animal part of him that had been through enough to know that you didn't announce yourself until you understood what you were announcing yourself into. He saw the car before he saw anything else. Dark sedan, parked across from the building, engine off but the exhaust still faintly visible in the cold air. Recently killed, minutes ago, not longer. Different vehicle than the white Civic Boone had flagged, different plates. Same posture. A car trying to look like it belonged somewhere it didn't. Jace walked the Harley to the building's side alley without a sound. He stood in the alley for 30 seconds. Then he sent a single text to Priest. Ravenna, now, don't call. He went up the stairs 2 at a time. Evelyn opened the door before he knocked. She'd been watching from the window. He could tell because she had the particular alertness of someone who had been watching and waiting, eyes moving past him into the hallway before settling on his face. She stepped back to let him in and closed the door behind him without a word. Harper was at the kitchen table. She was sitting with both hands flat on the table surface, palms down, fingers spread, in the specific posture of someone who is using physical contact with something solid to stay inside their own body. Her face was, he didn't have the right word for it, not distressed exactly, something more interior than distress. She was somewhere inside herself, looking for something, and the face she was wearing was the face of the search. She looked up when he came in. You ran the light on Corliss, she said. He blinked. How do you... I heard the engine. You were moving too fast for the distance. She looked at his face. And you look like someone called you. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Evelyn moved to the counter, turned the kettle on, stood with her back to the room in a way that was giving them space while still being present, which was something he was going to need to think about later. The specific intelligence of how Evelyn Reed occupied a room. They called, he said. Harper looked at him. Her hands didn't move from the table. It came back positive, he said. As gently as he knew how, which was not as gently as the moment deserved, but was everything he had. You're... Harper, you're Ava. You're my daughter. The kitchen was very quiet. The kettle began its low preliminary hiss. Harper, Ava, sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at him, and he watched her face do something he couldn't track, something that moved through too many registers too fast to name. Shock. Then something that wasn't quite disbelief but wasn't acceptance either. Then something that looked almost like grief, which confused him, until he understood that what she was grieving in that instant was the self she'd built from nothing, the identity assembled from absence, the Harper Quinn who had survived 2 years not knowing who she was and had become, in that not knowing, something formidable and real. She was grieving the girl who hadn't had a father, because that girl was gone now. Okay, she said. One word. The same word she'd been using with him since the beginning. Her word for I'm processing this, don't push, but it sounded different now, smaller. Harper. He leaned forward. You don't have to. I said okay. She looked at him. I need a minute. He sat back. She took the minute. He watched her breathe, slow, deliberate, the controlled breathing of someone who had practiced not falling apart and was practicing it right now. And he sat across from her with his hands on the table between them and did not reach for her because she hadn't asked him to reach for her, and she had told him clearly what she needed from him, which was to be treated like someone who was not broken. Evelyn put a mug of tea in front of each of them. She sat down at the end of the table. The three of them sat in the Ravenna apartment while the snow came down outside, and the kettle settled into its post-boil silence, and no one said anything for almost 4 minutes. Then Harper said, "I remembered something tonight. Evelyn told me. Motorcycles." So she was looking at the tea. "I remembered the sound. I've heard your bike 100 times, and it never—" She stopped. "Tonight it just—" She pressed her lips together. "There was a word. Someone kept saying a word for me. I can't—" Her jaw tightened. "I can't get to it." He told himself not to say it. He told himself to let her find it. He lasted about 6 seconds. "Little stargazer," he said. Her eyes closed. He watched her face when the words landed, and it was the most painful thing he'd seen in 2 years, which was a high bar, because he had seen painful things. But this was different from pain. This was pain and recognition arriving simultaneously, the way a physical injury sometimes takes a moment to register, the way you know before you feel it. One tear, just one. She pressed it away with the back of her hand immediately, efficiently, the way she did everything. "Okay," she said, very quietly. "Okay." Evelyn's hand moved across the table and covered Harper's. Harper didn't pull away. Jace sat across from them both and felt something in his chest that had been locked for 2 years shift and crack along a seam he hadn't known was there, and he pressed both fists flat on the table and breathed through it, because falling apart was not something he was going to do in front of his daughter on the night she found out she had a father. He had 11 minutes of having known she was alive. He was going to stay functional for all 11 of them. His phone vibrated. "Priest." One word, "outside." Priest and Boone were in the alley when he came down. Boone had run the new plates from the sedan, registered to a freight logistics company in Renton, that Priest had already cross-referenced against the shell company structure they'd been building a picture of for 6 weeks. Different entity, same architecture. Varro's people were good at paperwork. They were less good at being invisible to a chapter full of men who had spent years learning to notice what didn't belong. "2 of them in the car," Boone said. He was wearing his cut over a heavy flannel, hands bare in the cold, which was either toughness or forgetfulness, and with Boone it was genuinely impossible to tell. "Driver and a passenger. Passenger has a camera." "How long have they been there?" Boone clocked them about 40 minutes ago. "Already had eyes on when I got the text." Priest's voice was low, the quiet of the alley around them filled with the sound of snow on asphalt, a fine, soft hiss. "They didn't follow you in. They were already here." Jace looked at the building. "They know the address," he said. "They've known it a while," Priest said. "Moving her didn't make her invisible. It just changed the address." He paused. "We should have moved her further. She has school." "Jace, I know." He turned back to face Priest. "What do they want? Still the same thing? Table renegotiation?" Priest's face did something that Jace recognized as the thing it did when Priest had information he was choosing how to deliver. "Talk," Jace said. "Cutter found something else." Priest looked at Boone, who looked at the alley wall in the way of someone deciding to be somewhere else. Boone took 3 steps toward the street and stopped there with his back to them. Priest turned back to Jace. "Varro isn't working alone on this. He's never worked alone. He has a partner, has had one for about 18 months. Priest paused. "Someone inside the Iron Remnant." The alley went very still. Jace heard the snow. He heard his own breathing. He heard, from somewhere across the neighborhood, the distant sound of a Harley idling, which was Cutter arriving late from the south end. But in the moment it sounded like something else, like time itself marking the before and after of what Priest had just said. "Who?" Jace said. "We're not certain." Priest. "Cutter's not certain. He has a thread, not a name." "What's the thread?" Priest looked at him for a moment. In the low ambient light of the alley, the reflected glow of the snow, the distant yellow of a street lamp. His face was difficult to read, but not impossible. What was on it was not what Jace expected. Not anger, not the hard tactical focus Priest wore when they were working a problem. What was on his face was grief. The specific grief of someone who has discovered that a thing they trusted was not what it appeared to be. "The Delancey address," Priest said, before we moved them. Varro's people found it fast. Too fast. He paused. Delancey is not connected to you through anything public. You never rode directly there from the shop or the chapter house. The only people who knew about that address were people at the table, Jace said. Yes. Jace stood in the snow and felt the geometry of it assemble itself in his head. The way evidence assembled when you were finally willing to look at it, when you stopped giving the possibility the benefit of the doubt and started giving the facts their due weight. Someone at the table, 11 men he'd ridden with, some for 4 years, some for 9, Cutter for 11, men he'd trusted with his life in the specific non-metaphorical sense, had trusted with the decision of whether to put themselves between him and harm, had trusted with the care of people he'd moved into buildings he thought were safe. Someone at that table had given Varro the address, had given Varro, possibly, much more than that. The car outside, Jace said. We can move them again tonight. It doesn't matter where we move them. His voice was very flat. If there's someone inside the chapter passing information, we move them somewhere new, and Varro has the new address by morning. Priest said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. We need to find him first, Jace said, before we do anything else. That takes time. How much time do we have? Priest looked at the building, at the lit window on the second floor where the shadow of Evelyn's shape moved past the glass. Cutter thinks the escalation is recent. Whatever arrangement Varro had, it may have been about information only, up until now, but the surveillance on the girl... He stopped. Jace, if Varro's people have been watching you and the girl, and someone inside has been telling Varro what she means to you, she becomes leverage. She becomes the leverage, the only leverage that works. Jace looked at the sedan on the street, at the dark shape of the passenger with the camera, at the ordinary quiet of the Ravenna block, the snow on the parked cars, the lights in windows, the world that didn't know what was being decided in an alley at 9 in the evening. Get Dell and Cutter here, he said. I need eyes on this block all night. He looked at Priest. And I need that name. I'm working on it. Work faster. He went back inside. He sat with Harper and Evelyn for 2 hours. He didn't tell them about the informant. He was not going to put that weight on a 12-year-old who had just found out in the span of a single evening that she had a father, a different name, and a history she couldn't fully access yet. He was not going to add, and also someone I trusted may be the reason you're in danger to that evening's inventory. He sat at the table and drank his tea and answered questions. Harper asked them with the systematic thoroughness he'd come to expect from her. One at a time, precise, no redundancy, each answer processed before the next question arrived. What had his daughter been like? What had the house been like? What had her mother been like? Which he answered as carefully and completely as he could, because Harper deserved Renata, deserved to know the woman who had been her mother, and he was not going to let his own grief compress that into something inadequate. He told her about Renata's laugh, about the way she'd made breakfast at all hours of the day because she believed breakfast food was not temporally bound, about the specific look she'd given him the first time she'd seen him on the Harley, which had been simultaneously terrified and deeply interested and had told him everything he needed to know about her. Harper listened to all of it with her hands around her mug. Evelyn sat at the end of the table and listened too, and Jace understood, watching her face, that Evelyn was doing the thing she had apparently been doing for 2 years, holding space for a child she'd claimed without knowing who that child had come from, building a life around the absence of the child's history, and now, gradually, without resistance, making room for the history to return. He thought about what that cost. He thought about it and looked at this woman, 63 years old, worn coat, reading glasses from 6 years ago, a life spent in service industries, who had found an unconscious child on a riverbank and told a paramedic I know her and taken her home and raised her and never once, as far as Jace could tell, treated her like anything other than a person worth fighting for. Evelyn, he said. She looked at him. Whatever happens, he said, you're not losing her. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Harper. Harper was looking at both of them, eyes moving between them, 12 years old and processing more than any 12-year-old should have to process in a single night. And then she said very matter-of-factly, no one is losing anyone. That's obviously not an option. Jace almost laughed. Almost. Obviously, he said. Harper looked at him, at her mug, at the table. I want to remember more, she said. The motorcycles, the stars. More than that. She looked up. Is that? It'll come, he said. Don't force it. I'm not forcing it, I'm just… She stopped. Did the head tilt. The one that still caught him would probably always catch him. I want to know who I was. You're the same person you've always been, he said. You just have more context. She considered this. That's actually a reasonable way to frame it. Thank you. Don't thank me. It's just accurate. She picked up her mug. I'm going to bed. She stood. She gathered her mug and carried it to the sink and rinsed it with the automatic efficiency she brought to all small domestic tasks. And then she stopped with her back to the room and stood at the sink for a moment without turning around. Jace, she said. Yeah. A pause. Not long. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. I'm glad you came back to the fence, she said. She went to her room. He sat at the table with the empty chair across from him and the snow on the window and Evelyn's hand wrapped around her mug, and he pressed his eyes closed for a moment and breathed. Cutter called at 11:47. Jace was in the alley behind the building, standing with Boone in the cold, both of them watching the street through the gap between buildings where they could see the sedan without being seen. The camera passenger had stopped photographing around 10. The car was still there, idling now, occasionally, to run the heat and then going quiet again. Talk, Jace said. Cutter's voice was different than it had been in the shop earlier. The precision was still there, but the steadiness underneath it was gone, replaced by something that in another man might have been called distress. The thread I was pulling, Cutter said, from the Delancey information. I went back through the chapter communications, the group line, the individual texts, everything I could access. He paused. I found a pattern. Cutter. It's Dell. The alley, the snow. Boone, 3 feet away, turned to look at him. Jace stood with the phone against his ear and felt the name land the way a certain kind of blow landed. Not the ones that hurt immediately, but the ones that took a second, where you felt the contact before you felt the damage. Dell, 51 years old, hardware store, 9 years with the chapter. The man who had offered his cousin's apartment in Ravenna. The man who had, in the process of providing safety, handed Vero the new address before they'd finished carrying the boxes in. The Ravenna apartment. His cousin's apartment. He thought about Dell's face at the table meeting, the question about the options, the offer that had been constructed to seem like generosity, like the practical thinking of a man with resources and community connections, the civilian member with the hardware store who understood logistics. It had been a trap. The entire move had been a trap. A way to place Harper and Evelyn somewhere Vero controlled the information flow about completely, somewhere the address was known only because Dell had made it known, which meant Vero had had eyes on this block from the moment they arrived. The car outside wasn't surveillance. It was confirmation. Vero making sure the pieces were where he'd put them. You're certain, Jace said. His voice was very quiet. I'm certain, Cutter said. Where's he now? He left the chapter house at 9. I've been trying to reach him. He's not answering. Boone was watching his face. Jace looked at Boone and saw Boone read the look and go very still. And then Boone turned back to the gap between the buildings and looked at the sedan, and his jaw tightened and the vein in his temple became visible in the ambient light of the snow. Lock down the chapter house, Jace said. No one in or out until I get there. And Cutter, he paused. Don't tell anyone why. Not yet. He hung up. He looked at Boone. Dell, Boone said. Not a question. Yeah. Boone was quiet for 3 seconds. He had known Dell for 6 years. He'd helped Dell move his mother out of a nursing home that was failing her. Dell had been at his shoulder at 2 military funerals. Okay, Boone said. I need you here. On the building. I'm here. Don't let anyone up that doesn't come through me first. I don't care who it is. Understood. Jace looked at the building one more time. The lit window, the ordinary face of it in the snow, The Ravenna apartment where his daughter and the woman who'd raised her were sleeping or trying to sleep. And then he walked to the Harley and started it and pulled out of the alley without the headlight on for the first half block, running dark through the snow. And then the light came on and he opened the throttle and the engine roared through the quiet street. He found Dell at the chapter house. Not because Dell hadn't tried to run. He had. His car was in the lot with the engine still warm, which meant he'd come back after Cutter's calls went unanswered, which meant either panic or the specific overconfidence of someone who'd believed until the last moment that he wasn't going to be found out, and had come back to perform normalcy and found the building locked down and Cutter at the door. He was sitting in the main room at the long table when Jace came in. Every other man in the room was standing. Dell sat with his hands on the table and looked at Jace coming through the door, and his face went through several things very quickly. Jace watched them all and recognized them. The calculation of denial, the recognition that denial wouldn't work, the assessment of what damage control was still possible, and then, underneath all of that, something older and simpler. The face of a man who had been doing something he was ashamed of and had just run out of time to keep doing it. The room was very quiet. Jace stood at the far end of the table. He did not sit down. He looked at Dell for a long moment without speaking. "How long?" he said. Dell looked at his hands. 14 months. "What did you give him?" "Routes, meeting times, club financials, nothing operational, nothing that..." "The Delancey address." Dell's jaw worked. "The Ravenna apartment," Jace said. Silence. "My daughter's location," Jace said. The room was still. Absolutely still. No one moved. The fire in the corner had burned down and no one had fed it, and the room was getting cold. The chill coming in through the old industrial windows, and in the cold stillness, every man in that room was holding something. Dell's 9 years, the meals and the rides and the funerals and the fundraisers and the specific ordinary texture of a man you've trusted, holding it and feeling it change shape in their hands into something else. "He had my store," Dell said. "He had leverage on my financing. If I didn't..." He stopped. "He was going to take everything I'd built. So you gave him something else to take." "I didn't know about the girl. Not at first. Not until..." He stopped again. "But you knew eventually." Dell looked up. His eyes were the eyes of someone who understood exactly what they'd done and had been living with that understanding for longer than they'd admitted to themselves. "Yeah," he said. "I knew." Jace looked at him for a long time. He was aware of Priest to his left and Cutter to his right, and the rest of the chapter filling the room behind him. The specific weight of 11 men who had been together through enough that betrayal didn't just sting. It restructured something. It changed the load-bearing walls of how they understood their own safety with each other. He thought about the sedan outside the Ravenna apartment, the camera passenger, Dell providing the address with a cousin's generosity, a practical solution, a perfect trap. He thought about Harper at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood, looking for herself. "You're done," Jace said. It came out very quiet and very final. Not shouted, not performed. The sentence of a man who understood that some things, once broken, didn't get repaired. Dell nodded. "Once." He stood up from the table. He took off his cut and set it on the table in front of him, folded it once, and pushed it toward the center. He walked to the door. Cutter stepped aside. He went through and the door closed, and he was gone. No one spoke for a moment. Then Priest said, "Varro knows we're consolidated." "Yes," Jace said. "Which means he moves soon, before we can regroup and relocate." "He's already moved," Jace said. "He's been parked outside the Ravenna apartment for 6 hours with a camera. Whatever he's building toward it tonight." The room tightened. "How many men can we put on the building in 20 minutes?" Jace asked. "All of us," said Boone's voice from his phone. Boone, still on the street, who'd been listening. "I'm watching the sedan. Driver just got on a phone. He's calling it in," Priest said. "We move now," Jace said. "Everything, everyone, right now." He was already going back to the door. And that was when Boone's voice came through the phone again, tight and stripped of everything except information. The voice of a man describing what he was seeing with no inflection because inflection took time they didn't have. Jace, second car just turned onto the block. Then a third. A pause. 4 guys out of the second car. I can see. Another pause. They're not carrying cameras. The chapter house erupted into motion around him. Men pulling on cuts, moving toward bikes. The whole room converting from stillness to organized velocity in under 15 seconds. The specific efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this, who understood that the distance between a meeting and a response was the margin everything depended on. Jace hit the door at a run. Behind him, the chapter house lights went out, one by one as the room emptied, the building going dark, and the only sound was the rolling thunder of Harley engines starting in sequence out front. 1, then 3, then 6, then all of them. The sound building until it was bigger than the building, bigger than the street. The sound of something that would not stop for weather or distance, or the specific human arrogance of a man who thought he understood what he'd built a trap to catch. Jace opened the throttle. He had 7 minutes, maybe 8. He had 7 minutes to get between his daughter and whatever Dominic Vero had decided a 12-year-old girl was worth. He made it in 6 minutes. He knew he made it in 6 minutes because he counted them the way he counted everything under pressure must, not by clock, but by heartbeat, by the specific rhythm of a body running on adrenaline and the particular clarity that came when the options narrowed to 1. The Ravenna block was already wrong when he turned onto it. The sedan was still there, but both doors were open now, which meant the men who'd been in it were not in it anymore, and the third car Boone had called, a black SUV running lights only, was angled across the mouth of the alley behind the building, blocking the exit. Planned. Vero's people didn't improvise, they prepared, and the preparation told you everything about what they'd intended from the start. Boone came out of the gap between buildings at a run. 2 went up the stairs, Boone said, 3 minutes ago. I couldn't... His voice had something in it Jace had never heard in 8 years of knowing him. I couldn't hold both points at once. How many total? 5 that I've seen. Maybe more. Jace was already off the Harley and moving toward the building's front entrance when the sound of the chapter's bikes came around the corner. Not 1 or 2, but all of them. The full rolling thunder of 9 motorcycles turning onto the block in loose formation, headlights cutting through the snow, the sound of them filling the street like something geological, something that had been building underground for a long time and had finally broken through. They hit the block and fanned out without a word exchanged. Years of riding together, of making decisions in formation, of understanding each other's instincts. It translated here without translation. Priest took the alley end. Cutter and 2 others blocked the sedan's exit route. The rest dismounted and moved toward the building with the controlled urgency of men who understood that speed and violence were not the same thing, that what was needed right now was presence, overwhelming, undeniable, the specific message sent by numbers and certainty. Jace hit the stairs. Tick. The apartment door was not broken. It was open. Not forced. The lock was intact. Which meant Dell had given Vero a key, or Dell had given Vero the building manager's contact, or Dell's cousin had more involvement than a vacant apartment, and Jace filed all 3 possibilities away in the back of his mind for later because right now the door was open and the light in the kitchen was on, and he went through with his shoulder forward and his hands ready. The kitchen was empty. The main room was not. 2 men, one by the window, broad, close-cropped, holding a phone that he was not using as a phone, the camera passenger from the sedan, now here in the room with a different purpose than documentation. The other by the hallway that led to the bedrooms, taller, with the stillness of someone who had done this kind of thing enough that it no longer required movement to be threatening. Evelyn was on the couch. She was upright, hands in her lap. Her face had the expression of someone who had made a decision about how to behave in this situation and was executing that decision with the same deliberate competence she brought to everything else. She was not performing calm. She was actually calm, in the specific way of someone who has survived enough that the body stops catastrophizing and just assesses. She met Jace's eyes when he came through the door. She looked toward the hallway. Harper's room. The tall man by the hallway moved to put himself between Jace and the hallway door, which told him everything. "She's not involved," Jace said. His voice came out level. He was working to keep it level. "Whatever Vero wants, it's between him and me." "Vero wants a conversation," the broad man said. "He's been trying to have it for a while." "Then he can come here and have it." He doesn't come to conversations, he sends them. Behind Jace, the sound of boots on the stairwell. Priest, two others. The broad man heard them too. He looked at the door. He looked at Jace. He made the calculation that most people made when the Iron Remnant arrived in numbers, the same calculation every time. That these were men who had already decided, who didn't bluff, who were not going to be moved by the threat of escalation because they had already accepted the escalation and chosen their position inside it. The broad man's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something shifted in his face. He took one step back from the window. "Call him off," he said. "Tell your people in the alley to back the bikes up." "No," Jace said. "Then we have a problem." "You already had a problem," Priest said from the doorway. "You just didn't know what size it was." The tall man by the hallway hadn't moved. He was the one Jace was watching, the one closest to Harper's door, the one whose stillness was not passivity but readiness, the one whose hands were not quite at rest. Jace watched him the way you watched something dangerous that hadn't decided yet. Then Harper's door opened. Everyone in the room went still. She stood in the doorway in her school jacket over her pajamas, wool hat still on, and she looked at the room, at the two men, at Evelyn on the couch, at Jace in the doorway with Priest behind him, and she assessed all of it in approximately 3 seconds with those dark eyes that missed nothing, and then she looked at the tall man beside her door. "Move," she said. The tall man blinked. "You're standing in my doorway," she said. "Move." He moved, fractionally. Not because he'd been ordered to, but because something about the specificity of it, a 12-year-old girl in a wool hat telling him to move with the flat certainty of someone who expected to be obeyed, broke the geometry of the moment just enough to shift him sideways. Harper walked out of the hallway and stood next to Evelyn. Evelyn put her arm around her without looking away from the room. And Jace looked at the two of them. This woman who had claimed a child from a riverbank, and this girl who had cut a stranger from a trunk, and the two of them sitting together on the couch, with their shoulders touching, solid and unperformed and completely without performance of fear, and felt something move through him that was not a thought and not a feeling, but some compound of both, something that had been building for 3 weeks and had arrived at this moment with the force of everything that had accumulated behind it. He turned back to the broad man. "Tell Vero," he said, "that the conversation is over. You don't get to—" "Tell him." His voice dropped. Not louder, quieter, which was the thing that worked when louder wouldn't. "Tell him there's no leverage here anymore. Tell him whatever he thought he had on me stopped working the second he sent people into a room with a 63-year-old woman and a 12-year-old kid." He took one step forward. "And tell him that we know about Dell, which means we know about the construction accounts in Renton and the shell company in Tacoma and the 18 months of information he's been paying for. Tell him I have everything Cutter pulled, and Cutter is thorough." The broad man looked at his phone. He looked at Jace. He looked at Priest in the doorway, and then past Priest at the hallway behind him, where the sound of boots was no longer just 2 men, but 4, 5. The chapter filling the stairwell, patient and certain, the sound of men who had nowhere else to be. "This isn't over," the broad man said. "I know," Jace said, "but tonight it is." The 2 men left. They left without ceremony, without threat, with the specific deflation of people whose calculation had not worked out the way they'd mapped it. Boots on the stairs, the front door. Silence. Jace stood in the middle of the room and breathed. Evelyn's hand moved on Harper's shoulder. Once, a small press. Harper was looking at Jace. Her face was doing the thing it did. The assessment, the processing, the careful internal accounting of what had just happened and what it meant and what it cost. Then she said very quietly, "They were going to use me." "Yes." "To make you stop." "Yes." She looked at the floor, at the wall, at him. "Did you know they were coming tonight?" "Not soon enough." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sound of Harleys idling in the street below, not racing away, not making a point of departure, just present, just there, the low rolling sound of them like something breathing. She went to the window and looked down at the block, at the motorcycles arranged in the snow, at the men standing beside them. She stood at the window for a long time. "Are they staying?" she said. As long as we need them to, Jace said. She looked at the bikes, at the snow, at the street below where 9 men stood between her and whatever came next. She put her hand flat on the glass. Okay, she said. But as she said it, Priest appeared in the doorway behind Jace, and the look on his face was not the look of a man whose problem had just left through the front door. It was the look of a man who had just gotten a message that the problem was larger than the room they'd been managing. He held up his phone. One line on the screen. Vero's not in Seattle. He's been at the lakeside property. Jace's cabin. For 2 hours. The cabin. The place Jace had kept since before the flood. The place that held everything he hadn't been able to throw away. Mia's drawings still on the refrigerator. Renata's coffee mug still on the shelf. The photograph on the mantle of the 3 of them at the coast. The last one taken before everything. The place Varro had had 2 hours to search, to destroy, to use as the message he hadn't been able to deliver through leverage. Jace read the message. He read it again. He looked at Harper at the window, her hand on the glass, the snow coming down outside, the bikes below. He looked at Priest. How many does he have with him? Jace said. Priest looked at the second message that had just come in. His face went very still. Enough, Priest said, that we're going to need all of us. Outside, the Harley engines idled in the snow, and the night was not over, and Dominic Varro was 40 minutes north at a lakeside cabin that held the last physical remains of everything Jace Maddox had. They rode north in formation, all 9 of them, through the snow, through the 40 minutes of highway that separated the Ravenna apartment from the lakeside cabin. And the sound of them on the empty road was the sound of a decision that had already been made, unanimous and irreversible, the kind that didn't require a vote because everyone in the formation already knew what they were riding toward and had chosen to ride anyway. Jace was at the front. He thought about the cabin the whole way, not tactically. Priest handled tactics, running the approach on comms, coordinating positions, the language of men who understood how to move together through difficulty. Jace thought about the photograph on the mantle, Renata's coffee mug. Mia's drawings still taped to the refrigerator because he hadn't been able to take them down, because taking them down had felt like the final surrender he'd been refusing for 2 years. He thought about what Varro had had 2 hours to do to all of it. He opened the throttle and the formation responded, 9 engines rising together, and the snow came at them sideways off the sound, and the trees on either side of the highway were dark shapes, and the headlights cut through all of it, and he rode. Chuck. The cabin sat on a 1/4 acre above the water, a structure that had been modest when he'd bought it, and had remained modest because he'd never had the impulse to make it otherwise. Wood frame, covered porch, a dock that needed 2 boards replaced every spring, the kind of place that looked like nothing from the road and like everything once you were inside it. The lights were on. 4 vehicles in the gravel drive, 2 trucks and 2 sedans angled in the way of people who'd arrived without concern for their own exit, which told you something about how Varro had assessed the situation. He'd expected to be finished here before anyone arrived. He'd expected a different night. Priest split them without speaking, 3 to the tree line on the east, 2 covering the dock approach, the rest moving toward the front with Jace. They went through the tree line in the snow without headlights, the bikes going dark 200 yards out, coasting in on momentum and the slope of the drive. Jace went through the front door. What followed was not clean. It was not choreographed. It was 6 minutes of close-quarters chaos in the small rooms of a lakeside cabin, the specific violence of men in confined spaces making non-negotiable arguments. And when it was over, 4 of Varro's people were on the porch in the cold, and Varro himself was in the main room with Priest's hand on his collar and the photograph still on the mantle and Renata's mug still on the shelf, because Varro had not touched those things. Had not needed to. He'd come for documents, for the financial records Cutter had pulled, for the hard drive Jace kept in the desk drawer, for the architecture of evidence that could dismantle 18 months of careful construction. He hadn't found it. Cutter had pulled it 2 days ago. Varro understood that now. He was 53 years old and he had the face of a man who had spent decades being the one with leverage, and had arrived, for the first time, at a room where the leverage was gone. He looked at Jace across the main room and said nothing, because there was nothing that served him anymore, and Dominic Varro did not spend words on things that didn't serve him. "It's done," Jace said. You think so, Varro said. The Renton accounts, the shell structure, the 18 months of payments to a man inside my chapter. He watched Varro's face. Cutter's thorough. I said that already. He took one step forward. You're done here, in this city, with my chapter and everyone connected to it. His voice was very quiet. And you're going to leave the South End alone. The community work we do down there, the people we cover. You don't touch any of it. Or everything Cutter found goes to the 3 federal agencies currently interested in construction fraud in King County. Jace looked at him. You know they're interested. You've been managing that interest for 2 years. It's expensive. He paused. Stop managing it and let them look where they want to look. Varro held his gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at the photograph on the mantel. Jace watched him look at it. The 3 of them, the coast, the last one taken. Varro's eyes moved across it with the assessment of a man who understood what it meant and what it cost to have lost it and what it meant that Jace was still standing in this room. Fine, Varro said. Not concession, not surrender, just the flat pragmatism of a man recalculating his investments. Priest let go of his collar. They walked him out. When the last vehicle left the gravel drive, when the red taillights disappeared around the tree line and the sound of the engines faded into the snow and the water and the dark, Jace stood on the porch of the cabin and breathed. The lake was flat and black below. The snow had slowed to something gentle, intermittent, flakes coming down now with the randomness of things that had lost their urgency. The dock extended into the dark water, those 2 boards still needing replacement in spring, still waiting. Cutter came and stood beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. The hard drive, Cutter said finally. Safe, Jace said. I know it's safe. I took it. Cutter looked at the lake. I meant, we should decide what to do with it. Hold it, Jace said. As long as we need to. Cutter nodded. The water moved below them, small and dark, and somewhere across it a light was on in a distant house, the ordinary light of someone awake at 2 a.m. for ordinary reasons. And Jace looked at that light for a moment and thought about ordinary reasons. Go home, he said to Cutter. You sure? Yeah. One by one the chapter mounted up and rode out, the formation breaking into singles and pairs as they hit the highway, heading south toward the city, toward the specific ordinary lives that existed on the other side of nights like this one. The sound of them diminished gradually, the engine notes separating and fading until the last one rounded the curve and the lakeside was quiet. Jace went inside. He stood in the main room of the cabin for a long time, the photograph on the mantel, Renata's mug, the drawings on the refrigerator, a horse, a star, something that was supposed to be him on the Harley and looked more like a rectangle with wheels, done in blue crayon by a 7-year-old who'd had better things to do than worry about proportion. He put his hand flat on the refrigerator door, breathed. Then he picked up his phone and called the Ravenna apartment. Harper picked up on the second ring. You're okay, she said. Not a question. We're okay. A pause. He heard her breath on the line, the specific sound of someone who had been holding themselves together and was cautiously, partially releasing the hold. Evelyn made tea, Harper said. She makes tea when she doesn't know what else to do. That's not a bad instinct. She's made 3 pots. He almost laughed. Almost. I'll be back in the morning. Okay? A pause. Jace? Yeah. The word. Her voice had changed, gone quieter, gone to a place he recognized as the place she went when she was accessing something she usually kept under lock. Little stargazer. I remembered it before you said it tonight, just before. It was already there. He stood in the cabin with his hand on the refrigerator door and the crayon drawing under his palm and said nothing, because there was nothing that wouldn't be inadequate. Okay, he finally said. Okay, she said back. He drove south through the snow. Moz. The diner was Evelyn's idea. 3 weeks after the night at the cabin, when the paperwork was filed and the legal framework was in place, a custody arrangement that had required 2 attorneys and a family court judge, who had seen enough unusual situations to approach this one with equanimity, Evelyn said she wanted breakfast. She said it the way she said most things, as a fact rather than a suggestion, complete in itself, not requiring agreement so much as attendance. They went to a place on the highway south of the city, a roadside diner with a neon sign that had been missing the second E in coffee for so long that the regulars had stopped noticing. It had 12 tables and a counter and a cook who had been working the grill since before anyone currently eating there had been born. It smelled like coffee and bacon grease and something underneath both of those things that was just the smell of a place where people had been coming for a long time. They took a booth by the window. Outside, the Iron Remnant chapter had parked in a loose configuration across the lot. Not formally, not in the organized way of a club run, but in the organic way of people who had ended up somewhere together and arranged themselves accordingly. Some of them had gone inside and taken the counter. Cutter had a coffee and was talking to the cook about something that involved hand gestures indicating engine displacement. Boone was outside by the fire barrel that the diner kept lit through winter, standing with two other members in the cold, talking with their hands in their pockets, the way people talked when they were not particularly talking about anything. Priest sat 2 tables over with his own coffee, reading something on his phone, and when Jace looked at him, he looked up and nodded once, the specific nod that meant all clear, everything handled, this is just breakfast now, and looked back at his phone. Harper sat across from Jace with the menu, which she did not need because she had already decided on the eggs and the toast and the hot chocolate, but which she read anyway because she read everything placed in front of her. Evelyn sat beside her reading, glasses on, looking at the menu with the concentration of someone who took the selection of breakfast food seriously. The coffee came. Jace wrapped both hands around the mug. Outside the window, the snow from the night before was still on the parking lot, compressed by tires into gray ridged tracks, the neon reflection of the sign making it pink at the edges. The morning was the specific gray of Pacific Northwest winter mornings that could go either way. Clear off by 10 or stay heavy all day, the sky withholding its intentions. Harper put her menu down. She looked at Jace. She looked at Evelyn. She looked out the window at the bikes in the lot, at the men around the fire barrel, at Cutter's gesturing hands visible through the diner window. "This is really your family," she said. Not a question, not quite a statement, something between the way her observations often were, a thing she was saying out loud to see how it fit. "Yeah," Jace said, "and now it's mine. If you want it." She looked at the fire barrel, at the bikes, at the gray morning pressing against the glass. Her face was doing the thing it sometimes did now, not the controlled assessment of someone managing threat, but something more open, more unguarded, the expression of a person who was still learning what safety felt like from the inside and finding it stranger and more demanding than danger had been. "I want it," she said. Evelyn put her hand over Harper's on the table. Harper looked down at their hands. Then she turned hers over and held on. The food came. The diner filled with the sound of the chapter and the smell of coffee and the ordinary noise of a morning that had nothing urgent in it, no threat assessment, no geometry of exits, just eggs and toast and Cutter winning whatever argument he was having with the cook and Boone coming in from the cold and sitting at the counter and ordering something enormous. Jace drank his coffee. He looked at the photograph he still carried in his jacket pocket, the one from the mantel, the 3 of them at the coast. He'd taken it down the morning after the cabin and carried it since, not as an object of grief, but as what it actually was, evidence of something that had existed and still existed, differently, changed in shape but not in substance. He put it on the table between his coffee mug and Harper's hot chocolate. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she picked it up. She looked at the woman in it, at the man, at the small girl between them, 7 years old, squinting into coast light with her father's stubborn jaw and her own particular eyes, crescent scar just visible at her temple, tilting her head at something outside the frame. "She looks like she knows something," Harper said. "She always did," Jace said. Harper set the photograph down carefully. She looked at it one more time. Then she picked up her hot chocolate and looked out the window and said nothing, and the nothing she said had the quality of someone who had come a very long way and was, for the first time, not in a hurry to be anywhere else. The neon sign buzzed above the parking lot. The fire barrel threw orange light across the snow. Somewhere in the lot, one of the Harleys ticked as it cooled, the metal settling into the cold morning, all that motion finally at rest. Jace looked at his daughter. She was looking at the sky, which had made its decision, clearing, the gray pulling back from the east, the first pale winter light beginning to come through. She noticed him looking. "Stars are still up," she said. "If you know where." "I know where," he said. She almost smiled. And then she did. Not almost, not held back, just fully, the way a 12-year-old smiled when she'd decided something was worth it. It lasted about 3 seconds, and then she went back to her hot chocolate and the clearing sky, and her face returned to its usual careful composition, but the 3 seconds had been real, and they had been enough. Outside, the morning came on. The bikes waited in the lot, patient as they always were, ready when they were needed and quiet when they weren't. The men around the fire talked about nothing in particular. The diner held them all. The loud ones and the quiet ones, the ones carrying visible damage and the ones carrying the invisible kind. The woman with the reading glasses and the girl with the wool hat and the man who had spent 2 years looking for something he'd finally stopped having to look for. Family, Jace had learned, was not the absence of loss. It was what you built in the space loss left behind. Built carefully, built stubbornly, with whoever was still standing, with whoever had stayed. He picked up his coffee. He drank it while it was hot. Outside, the first real light of morning broke through the cloud line over the sound and hit the snow in the parking lot and turned it briefly, purely white, and the neon sign buzzed its incomplete word into the new day, and the Harleys waited, and the world, cold and imperfect and still asking things of everyone in it, went on. As it did, as it always had, as it would.